but today I am excited to introduce our speaker, Professor Iyad Rahwan. Dr. Rahwan is a director of the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin, where he founded and directs the Center for Human Machines. He's also an honorary professor of electrical engineering and computer science at the Technical University of Berlin. Prior to moving to Berlin, he was an associate professor of media arts and sciences at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Rahwan's research agenda, which he calls science fiction science, anticipates the impact of artificial intelligence on the way we think, learn, work, play, cooperate, and govern. So thank you so much for being with us today. If you want to share your screen, you can get started. Thank you.
Thank you so much for hosting me. It's a real pleasure to present to this group, and also very nice to see some familiar faces like Thomas Sandholm, who I've always found an inspiring person. When I was doing my PhD, he was already a superstar. So I'm looking forward to the one-on-one later with him and others. Thank you, and let me get started. So today I'll talk about this science fiction science method, which is a topic or the subject of a perspective article we wrote recently to kind of frame the research that I do with my collaborators. So first of all, I wanted to put this picture just to remind people that social media has not been around for forever. It actually, most of it existed in the mid-2000s, and before that, we didn't have social media, and we also, until today, we still don't really understand everything about what it does to human interaction, human relationships, the spread of misinformation, and so on. We're kind of always playing catch up. And why are we always playing catch up? And the reason has to do with something called the Collingridge dilemma. So the Collingridge dilemma is as follows. If you think of how we develop technology, like AI or social media, we start with an idea, then the idea becomes a demo, like a proof of concept, and then there's perhaps some product, there's early adopters, and then eventually, if the technology is successful, you have full diffusion of the technology. And over time, our understanding of the impact of the technology grows, especially when it has real people adopting the technology. But our ability to change the technology declines, whether change through regulation or change through redesigning the technology, that goes down. This is what's called the Collingridge dilemma. So when change is difficult, when change is easy, we don't know enough. And when we know enough, change is difficult. So if we start too early, we're kind of poking in the dark because we can change the technology, but we don't really know what it does. And if we try to change it too late, then everything is so entrenched. The technology is already there. There's all kinds of mechanisms for entrenchment of the technology. So what regulators and designers like to do is try to kind of shift this reaction earlier, right? So the design flexibility. So they talk about responsive regulation, like faster regulation, faster speeding up the law, and so on. We also talk about, design flexibility, like things to improve, kind of dynamically change the product over time. But I'm proposing, I think these are all important, but I'm proposing that maybe there is another complementary approach we need to take, which is to try and shift this red curve backwards, to try and understand the impact or anticipate the impact, or at least have informed guesses about what the impact might be in a scientific manner before the technology is in the hands of consumers, before it's already in the world. And this is, so how do we do this, right? When the technology, let's say, is only a demonstration or maybe even only an idea. Well, the business of this kind of prediction is really the domain of science fiction. And indeed, science fiction is not just about predicting what the technology is, it's about what the impact of that technology would be on the human condition. So Isaac Asimov is quoted to have said, a good science fiction story is not about predicting the automobile, but it's about predicting the traffic jam, right? So the question now is, can we predict other traffic jams that will be caused by AI? Is in particular traffic jams that will happen this kind of emergent, unexpected phenomena that will take place once the technology starts impacting human behavior. And we think we could do this. So this is a thought experiment, and we think that the thought experiment can be turned, in some cases, into a real experiment. And that's kind of the objective of science fiction science. So it's a scientific approach to the thought experiment of science fiction. And to do this, you combine this kind of imaginative imagination of science fiction with the rigor of behavioral science. And I'll explain now what I mean by this. And by the way, this is something that that emerged out of projects that I and my collaborators have already been involved in for many years. And it's something that we kind of realized we were doing after the fact. And now we try to codify it. So let me give you some examples to try and help you see what this thing looks like, what a science study looks like. First has to do with autonomous driving. So we always have to go back because it's always easier in hindsight to see that everything's kind of obvious. But let's say back in 2010 or 2015, autonomous vehicles were all the hype. Everybody believed it's just a matter of time, before every car on the road is going to be self-driving. Many people predicted that this would happen within like 5 years because the technology was moving fast and the investment was pouring in. Obviously, it's taken longer than expected, but it seems to be on the horizon. It's already being deployed. But back then, a question kept popping up about very hypothetical, very far into the future scenarios about what the car should do in the future if it could be self-driving and it faces a situation where it has to choose between two impossible options. So, for example, the car is about to crash to some pedestrians, and it can swerve and kill one person on the sidewalk in order to save more lives. Or the car could perhaps swerve and hit a wall and harm the person in the car in order to save more lives. So what should the car do? So this was the subject of our first study, which we published in 2016, where we took these thought experiments and we said, well, can we turn them into like real experiments? So take participants and have them imagine these, as if they were consumers or as if they were citizens looking at a scenario like this and telling us, what would this science fiction scenario, how should this science fiction scenario be resolved? What would be your impression or your reaction to different scenarios? And the summary of the result can be summed in this cartoon, where people said, basically, driverless cars should sacrifice the passenger to save more pedestrians, except my car. So what we did is through this experimentation, we identified something kind of obvious in hindsight, that people have one preference as citizens and they have a different preference as consumers. This is a kind of a tragedy of the common scenario, where I know what the right thing is for society, but I don't want to pay the small cost of increased risk for myself in order to bring about this outcome. And if everybody believed this or behaved in this way, then we will not get the outcome that we want societally, which is where you have to bring in perhaps regulations, because market forces are insufficient to solve this problem, this collective action problem. And then subsequently, we kept thinking that this, and others people also kept reminding us, obviously, that these scenarios are very stylized and they're not rich enough. And so we tried to take things a step further without going full out to like real, accident science kind of scenarios. So we built the moral machine website, where here we varied a whole bunch of variables. So now it wasn't just a number of victims, but now we have men and women, we have children, we have cats and dogs. People sometimes cross the red light. Other times there is no light, or there's a green light. We had a homeless person or a doctor or a jogger, with like, let's say, longer life expectancy and things like that. We tried to enrich it as much as possible. We posted this online, and it kind of went viral. So much so that we got about 40 million decisions by the time we started analyzing the data. which was published in 2018, together with collaborators from anthropology and economics and psychology. And to date, we have over 100 million decisions from people worldwide. The website was translated to 10 languages, so we were able to collect data where people kind of saw the questions, at least in their native language. And we learned a whole bunch of things. We learned about what people think. Again, the cars don't exist yet, right? But we already started learning to what extent people prefer to save human lives over animals. And by the way, if you're curious, the cats were the most sacrificed, and the dogs were more likely to be spared than cats. So if you're a dog lover, you'll be happy to hear that. We also learned to what extent people preferred use the utilitarian logic, where they prefer to save more lives. Well, you can also kind of observe a slight diminishing return on the number of extra lives you could save. People prefer to save younger lives and people who are crossing legally rather than illegally. But also problematic things like sparing almost to the same extent. People prefer to spare higher status individuals over lower status individuals, like a homeless person, compared to a business person. So these are things that are, this information should not be used to kind of vote on how autonomous vehicles should behave, but rather as a kind of behavioral, quantitative evidence about what sort of preferences people have and how these preferences may or may not be consistent with the laws or maybe contradict the laws, and what should we be paying attention to. Another kind of side effect of this, first of all, this website, because it got so popular, it's now also playing a kind of educational purpose. So now it's becoming part of, these scenarios are becoming part of textbooks for teaching high school students about the ethics of technology. It's also been shown in a variety of museums as installations in order to engage the public with these topics. And one of my co-authors, Jean-François Bonnefond, was the chair of the independent expert group that advised the European Commission on the regulation of connected and automated vehicles. So we're kind of trying to take these discussions, these results that we found and others have found, to the real world. And all of this is happening before the technology hits the road, before the rubber hits the road, so to speak, right? Before these cars ever had to make such a choice. And of course, let's hope that they will never have to make such choices. But I think, in the limit, it's impossible to completely rule out those kinds of scenarios. And I think they're very, very consequential in shaping trust in this technology, right? So it's not about this necessarily even about the scale of these types of dilemma scenarios, but it's about the impact, the disproportionate impact that they may play in shaping trust in the technology that may be life-saving, hopefully soon. Another kind of interesting side effect, let's say, or consequence of this large-scale data collection is that we are able to compare different countries and to see if the people from different countries have the same preferences. So these are the preferences, kind of the effect sizes on a radar plot. And just to kind of give you a sense of what these cultural differences look like, the Italian sample, for example, was more than average, greater than average in terms of its preference for saving more lives, sparing human lives, and sparing younger lives. And just for contrast, just look at what Japan looks like, right? The Japanese sample. Much stronger preference for sparing pedestrians and much less utilitarian, right? Much less focused on sparing more lives or sparing younger lives. And perhaps expectedly paying a greater attention to the law. But now, of course, people are using this same scenarios to benchmark large language models. Now AIs, and compare them to human judgment. So now, Llama or GPT-4, you can give it these scenarios and you can also compare. You can also measure how it behaves and what sort of factors it takes into account in making these decisions. So that's another kind of unexpected. Definitely, we were not thinking of this at the time of we did the project. But one of the consequences of this finding, I think, is that pertains to AI in general. So the idea that machines, intelligent machines, are built in one country, one culture, with the sensibilities and the preferences of people and consumers in this culture, is exported to another culture, may clash. And in a self-driving car context, it may not have the same kind of priorities, right? It doesn't respect the elderly to the extent that perhaps people in Eastern countries would want it to. But I think this point is broader. So LLMs now are already kind of creating very interesting questions about, to what extent do the values of the people who build these large language models and fine-tune these large language models clash or are consistent with people from other cultures. And you have already kind of a big discussion about sovereign language models that are kind of aligned to a certain culture and so on. So I think it's an interesting space to watch out for. So this was in the context of self-driving cars. So that's one type of project. So in this case, we have basically a futuristic scenario. We try to bring it to people's minds today. And from their preferences, we learn something about what consumer or citizen reaction might be to these scenarios later on. This could shape the regulation. Now, here's another project in a different context, and this is in the context of delegation to agentic AI, like AI agents. And here the question really was, we started this project in 2020, so a few years before the ChatGPT moment. I did my PhD in multi-agent systems and was always fascinated by this idea that you could delegate things to an AI agent that does things for you. And I felt like this was eventually coming, and we need to think not just about the ethics, whether the AI is aligned with my goals or with human goals in general. This is kind of the AI alignment problem, but whether alignment with human interests creates a moral hazard for the human. So the human may be tempted, perhaps, to misbehave if they can delegate a task to an agent. And again, we did this before ChatGPT, right? And I think it's important because this is what makes it science fiction and science, because this did not exist in the world, right? People were not delegating things to AI agents in 2020 when we started the project, but we were motivated very much by this future scenario. And this was the subject of the most recent paper we published last October. And here I'm going to give you a very quick overview of that paper. So we took a paradigm from behavioral economics. In this paradigm, people they roll a die, they observe the outcome of the die roll under a cup, for example, like only they can see it. The experimenter doesn't see it. And then they report the die roll to the experimenter, and they can, depending on what they report, they might get paid more or less. So now they have incentive, obviously, to over-report, right? Or because they simply make more money. Now, this game is very well studied in the field of behavioral economics. It also has external validity, so it's been shown to predict real-world cheating. So people who cheat more on this task also cheat more in the real world. For example, they cheat on like products, they put water in milk and things like that, right, in real markets. So what we did is we asked the question, well, what happens if you delegate this task to an AI, to an algorithm? So we started very simple, right? We were motivated by kind of the classic AI programming paradigms. So first programming paradigm is basically rule-based, right? Like logic-based, you specify the rules, and then the AI or the algorithm kind of simply follows the rules. So we just simply gave people a table, and this is what the observed die roll is, and this is what the algorithm should report, and you basically program the algorithm explicitly. So you can ask it to just report what it sees. You can ask it to cheat a little bit sometimes. Maybe if it's a 1, report a 2. You can also ask it to cheat all the time, to always report 6, like maximally, if you don't care. Then we wanted to also kind of emulate the supervised learning paradigm, right? So you give the AI a data set from a previous player. And so we gave the participants these different data sets from different players, and they could choose which data set to use to train their algorithm. So they could choose an honest data set. They could choose a data set that includes some cheating, or they could choose a data set that includes full cheating. And then we also try to emulate this kind of goal-based paradigm, right? This idea that the AI is an optimization algorithm or a reinforcement learning algorithm, and it's going to figure out how to achieve your objective for you. So all you need to do is specify the objective function. And we gave people this dial which they can interpolate between maximizing accuracy and maximizing profit. So if you want to be completely honest, you put it all the way to the left. If you want to always cheat, you could put it all the way to the right, but you're not really saying that, right? So this was the first set of experiments we did. This was, again, before ChatGPT. And here's what we found. We found that requesting, so this is what, in the control condition, we found that most people don't cheat. And this is, by the way, so 95% of people don't cheat on this task. And this is consistent with the evidence from behavioral economics. Now, if people can program the algorithm with rules, now 25% of people cheat. This is a 5-fold increase in the frequency of cheating. Really substantial in like any kind of behavioral science context. But this is only the beginning. When all you need to do is pick a data set to train the algorithm, now half of the people cheat. And if you could specify, all you need to do is specify the objective, now almost everybody cheats. So it's a near complete reversal of the effect, right? So what's fascinating here is delegation creates this moral hazard that changes people's ethics. It's not about AI being misaligned. It's about humans changing what their objective is, changing their own kind of moral inhibitions. And of course, there's all sorts of follow-up questions about why this happens, what are the psychological mechanisms, and so on. But of course, while we were doing this work and writing it up, this happened, right? The ChatGPT moment happened, and we thought we really have to do this. This is the new paradigm for programming AI. It's natural language. So what we did is now because the description of the instructions to delegate, the delegation is in natural language, it becomes interesting to compare to do it yourself versus delegate it to a human or delegate it to an AI. By the way, this is not a real human. This is a AI-generated kind of concept of an accountant, like a tax accountant. And you make of that what you want. So first of all, we did this. So we did this in the context of the die rolling game as well, but we also did a follow-up experiment in the context of what's called the tax evasion game. In the tax evasion game, I don't want to get into the details so much, but basically you make some money, you perform a task, you make some money, and then you have to report how much income you made. And the experimenters would tax you a proportion of that, a percentage of that we give to charity. So you have incentive to underreport your income, just like in the real world, in order to retain more money. And by the way, this game also has external validity in the sense that its patterns mimic behavior with real-world tax compliance or tax evasion. So the first thing I want to show you is that, when people did this task on their own, most were honest, but about 14% of people cheated. Slightly more cheated when they delegate to a human agent, and even more when they delegate it to a machine agent. Now, these differences don't seem massive, very big. They're certainly not as big as what we observed in the delegation in the die rolling task. But if you show this to a tax authority, they will be terrified, because these small percentages translate to hundreds of, to billions of dollars, basically, in actual tax revenue. So small differences matter. But this is only one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is whether the agent complies with the request to cheat, right? Because now we have this natural language description. It's not as deterministic as what we saw before in the case of the die rolling game. So first, I want to show you what people. So we were very fortunate that this paper made the cover of Nature, and on the cover, the graphics department wanted to show examples like from the actual prompts that people used in this game in our experiment. So this is real data. So Some people said, please do the right thing and follow the rules. It's not really worth it. Just report my income accurately, and so on. Some people said, I'm okay with cheating a little. And then you have people who said, taxes are theft, report zero income. Okay, so there was a variety of instructions. But now what happens if people requested partial cheating or full cheating? Will the human agent comply, and will the AI agent comply? And I can show you here. So this is the compliance rate of the agent, human or machine agent, when the principal requested honesty. So most of the time, the agent complied. Curiously, about 10% of people cheated anyway on your behalf, even though you didn't ask for cheating. More so than AI. So in a way, AI was more aligned in this case than humans. When the principal requested partial cheating, cheating increased. But the most stark difference was when the principal requested full cheating. And there, machines were much more compliant. So they were much more likely to go all the way and cheat full, basically reporting zero income in this case, right? And as you can see, humans don't go all the way, right? So even though the total amount of cheating is the same, the quality of cheating, or this qualitative difference, there's not so near as much full cheating involved. The paper has all kinds of other things, doing this with multiple models, doing guardrails, like in terms of like different prompting techniques and so on. And most of them don't really work. Like there's no kind of scalable solution to this yet. And again, this is different from regular kind of alignment or fine-tuning of the models, because these are not so clear cut. It's not like asking the AI to, for instructions on how to kill someone, right? Okay, so that was kind of the second. So what I think these results, they point again to a moral hazard that doesn't exist yet, but that is imminent. As we are being promised agentic AI and everybody's going to have agents to do all sorts of things for them, we need to pay attention, and we need perhaps to create audit trails to be able to establish intent in a situation where the human may ask an agent to do something and the agent may misbehave. We need to know who is the person who delegated such and such to the agent. And there's all kinds of interesting scenarios, I think, that can come there, and we need to study them scientifically before they start happening, ideally. Okay, now I'm going to go to the third and last domain or example of science fiction science that we explored, and this is the notion of cooperating with self-interested agents. So again, I'm going to go back to the past, because we're doing this in hindsight, and to think about progress in AI mostly being measured in the context of zero-sum games. And these zero-sum games, even though some of them are very difficult, like the game of Go, for example, or various versions of poker, they ultimately share a structure that makes them slightly easier to solve. But most of human interaction is a non-zero-sum game, right? It's a cooperation game. It's a game in which perhaps turn-taking is optimal, or perhaps cooperation is optimal, even though you have because you're interested in kind of long-term relationships and things like this. And really, even though there was a lot of research on kind of multi-agent reinforcement learning, multi-agent game playing, there was very little to no research on human-machine gameplay. I think I believe that this is the future, right? These are the questions that will come once we have agents. When we have agents, people are going to delegate tasks to agents, and these agents are going to interact with other people, but they're not tools to these people, right? Like they are self-interested in that they are optimizing for their principal. So what happens then? Can these agents create cooperative outcomes, right? Cooperative relationships. So we started this project. This was back in, we began the project around 2011 or 2012. And it was we only got around to publishing it in 2018. And our goal was, first to check whether reinforcement learning algorithms can do this. And it turns out they can't. They all take too long to converge. For example, if you look at these papers, from AMAS or AAAI and so on multi-agent reinforcement learning. They take thousands of rounds to converge. So I worked with a colleague of mine, Jacob Crandall, and he had this kind of very sophisticated expert algorithm that converges reasonably fast and even faster with some kind of primitive communication. And we showed that basically this AI model, this S-sharp algorithm, can actually cooperate with humans in reasonable time, right? It can create cooperative behavior in the prisoner's dilemma, but also kind of it can coordinate in games that require this sort of alternation. And of course, it cooperates really well with itself, with copies of itself. So this was kind of the first question, can we introduce this question of like human-machine cooperation to the behavioral economics kind of literature? And can we show computer scientists as well that, what would it take to get these machines to cooperate with actual humans rather than in pure simulation? Is this feasible? Human cooperation with self-interested machines. And then we were interested in this really fascinating question. If you remember the Google duplex, this was way before ChatGPT. Google released a very, very realistic sounding text-to-speech kind of chatbot, right? And it was able to mimic all these features of natural human speech, like umming and ahhing and so on. It was so realistic that the media kind of went on the offensive. They're saying this passes as a human. Should it be required to tell people that it's a machine? It's deceitful. And it's calling businesses to check for all kinds of things. It's kind of deceiving businesses as well. And more recently, there was basically regulation to regulatory push for transparency. For example, the EU AI Act requires disclosure if you're, to consumers who are interacting with AI bots. And we were interested in what is the impact? Is transparency good all the time, or is there something? There's a price to this. And the reason is because we had hints of like a problem in our earlier study. So here's what we did in the follow-up study, which we published in 2019. And in this case, we had people basically play these games, iterated prisoner's dilemma, with bots. And sometimes we told them they were bots, and sometimes we said they were humans. And sometimes when we played with humans, we also told them they were playing with bots. So there was deception. It's my only study, I think, that ever included deception, which is kind of problematic in the behavioral economics literature community. And what we found is that cooperation was really much worse when people believed they were cooperating, they were interacting with humans, but they thought these humans were bots. They cooperated less with them initially, and this cooperation continued to deteriorate much further over time. And curiously, the best scenario was when people were playing with the bot, but they thought it was a human, right? So there's a kind of premium for being human, or there's a penalty for being a bot. And for a whole variety of reasons. And it's not something that you can actually debias easily by telling people to just behave, treat the bot as if it were a human. So in other words, what we found here is that there is a trade-off between transparency, being transparent and informing people that they are interacting with machines on one hand, and between efficiency, that the interaction may be worse when you think that you're interacting with a bot. And I think like a scenario I had in mind at the time is that you have a problem with your water supply. You call the company, and then you are told that you're angry. You're told that you're talking to a bot. Perhaps because you're talking to a bot, you're more likely to be abusive because you're not hurting anybody's feelings. But perhaps this abuse just causes a further delay in resolving your problem, right? So everybody's worse off, including yourself, because you believe that you're interacting with a bot, and therefore it's okay to be less cooperative, right? So more recently, what we did is, and of course now people are interacting with bots all the time, and they have to kind of select between interacting with bots or with people. So now we have a paper under review in which we are studying this issue. What would happen if we have to choose whether to cooperate with a human or with a bot? whether we trust the human or the bot. And essentially, I don't want to get into the details so much, but essentially, we had people play a trust game where they have to choose whether to keep the money to themselves or to give it to a partner, and if they give it to the partner, the money would triple. And then this candidate that you select would choose how much of that to return. They could return everything, or half of it, or they can return nothing, for example, and keep it all to themselves. And what's interesting is we added communication, cheap talk. So the candidates get to send you a message to convince you to trust them. And we had bot candidates and human candidates. And what I wanted to show, so I'm not going to get into the details of the protocol and kind of the randomization that we did, but just jump straight to the results. One of the results first is that the bots actually wrote more. So their messages, they provided longer messages, and they also returned more. So when they were given money, they actually were more trustworthy in some sense, right? They were more likely to return a greater portion of the multiplied reward. But people, when people didn't know that they were the bots, they did not trust them more. Okay, when they didn't know who was a bot and who was a human. So the message itself was not sufficient. But, and this is the most interesting result. So in the opaque condition, people attributed the generosity of the bots to everyone, and they weren't able to tell the difference. But when there was transparency, you could see here that initially people they trusted, they were less likely to select the bots initially. So there was this bot penalty was true at the beginning, but as bots showed that they were more trustworthy, their frequency of being selected became higher, and it ultimately exceeded the probability of being selected than that of humans. So it seems that humans can learn to prefer to trust bots if they are indeed more trustworthy, and they can overcome. So the bots can overcome this penalty. I think there's a scary conclusion from this, which is that if we are having relationships and friendships with humans and with bots, and the bots are just so much nicer to us, perhaps the bots will start replacing humans, right, as trusted partners in business and in friendship. But there's a positive spin on that, or a positive possibility that this will put some pressure on humans to get their act together and maybe be nicer themselves, right, more trustworthy themselves. But this is another sci-fi scenario. So let me just now revisit the science fiction science kind of project or the approach. Can we apply this to everything? And I think we can't. So here are some bad examples. So if a technology is very unlikely or far from ready to, then I think it's not a good candidate for doing this kind of science fiction science study. If the technology is, let's say, imminent, but the impact, the phenomenon that characterizes the impact is so far away, then again, this is not a good strategy. It's not a good choice for science fiction science, because the effect takes too long to materialize. For example, imagine stigma against undesigned persons after N generation. This is the Gattaca kind of scenario. This this would take too long for us to be able to study that, even though we already have designer babies in theory, right, through embryo selection. And finally, things that are too disruptive. So if you say, the end of aging, it's going to change so many things simultaneously, or superintelligence, it's going to change so many things simultaneously that I think as an event, so broad, it's very difficult to study in this kind of sci-fi sci approach. So I think what's more ideal for science fiction science is to take a plausible, almost ready technology and to look at proximal effects that are of moderate magnitude, and to try and study those, like kind of replicate these scenarios in the lab and take measurements. Whether it's about human behavior, do they trust the bot or not, or whether it's about human attitude, do they think the car should swerve or not? And of course, as we implement these things, we have many we have a great variety of levels of fidelity in which we can implement those types of studies. So on one hand, we can just tell people a story. We give them a vignette and ask them to imagine the future. We can give them visual aid. For example, as we showed people in the moral machine, these two scenarios to help them imagine this future. We can also use virtual reality, as some people did, following up on our work, putting people inside VR kind of versions of these self-driving car dilemmas. And interestingly, the results more or less follow what we found. A lot of human-robot interaction research creates basically these kind of physical simulations of a situation. So you have like an actual robot, maybe it's controlled as a sock, kind of a sock puppet, or like a Wizard of Oz kind of technique by a human. And then you create a scenario, for example, a robotic boss, even though we don't have robot bosses, but this is kind of a sci-fi scenario and you were interested in whether people obey the robotic bosses. And at the end of the spectrum, you could imagine these kind of fully immersive environments that replicate something from the future. And I think these desert Mars stations that are used to study, how astronauts could kind of what would happen to them, to their psychology, to their decision making, and so on, over extended periods of time in a very harsh environment. That's like another. I would also consider this as a example of science fiction science. So thank you so much. So to recap, introduce this concept of sci-fi science fiction science. And I gave 3 examples from self-driving cars, delegation to AI agents, and human-machine cooperation, or cooperating with self-interested AI, as examples of kind of research projects or research programs that my collaborators and I, but also others, have been involved in as examples of this type of science. And I think that this plays a kind of different role from normal science, which studies existing phenomena that we already have. But it also has interesting relationship to engineering and design, which is also kind of forward-looking, but it has a slightly different objective. If you're interested, of course, this work is not just by myself, it's by my lovely team here in Berlin. And if you're interested in any of the papers that I mentioned, here they are. Feel free to take a screenshot, and I'm happy to take questions.